Welcome back, friends. It's 7 p.m. in New York City, and those of us here can hear the loud, heartfelt applause for essential workers who make our city and our society run. I'm Deepak Bhargava. I'm a distinguished lecturer here at the School of Labor and Urban Studies at CUNY. I'm very proud to work at SLU, and I want to thank all of the SLU staff who helped put this event together, and especially my faculty colleagues, the amazing Ruth Milkman and Penny Lewis. What a joy it's been to work with them. I hope you will connect to SLU as a student, join our excellent upcoming public programs, and read our journal, New Labor Forum. We've had an incredible day so far of discussion among leading academics, movement leaders, about the path forward for immigrant and social justice in America. And we have a star-studded finale for you tonight. I'm thrilled to introduce Dorian Warren, who will MC the town hall tonight. Dorian is president of Community Change, one of the premier social justice organizations in America. He's a scholar, organizer, media personality, and he's worked to advance racial, economic, and social justice for over 2 decades. He's also worked at MSNBC, Columbia University, the University of Chicago. He's brilliant, and he gives me great hope for the future of this country. He and Pramila Jayapal are also beloved by my 2 parents who are watching tonight. Hi, Mom and Dad. They are so excited that you are speaking with us tonight. So without further ado, Dorian Warren.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhargava, and welcome everyone to this concluding session of what's been an amazing day, exploring the future of immigration policy and strategy. Now, this evening's session is a town hall with immigrant rights movement leaders, and that includes some leading lights from Congress, the labor movement, and of course, the immigrant rights movement, who will share with us their perspectives on key issues and strategies as we all collectively build the movement we need to achieve the goals of immigrant justice and social justice. So first, we will hear from Representative Pramila Jayapal, a friend and hero to many of us, who will talk about the progressive agenda on immigration for Congress in 2021. Now, Congresswoman Jayapal is serving her 2nd term in Congress. She represents Washington's 7th district. She is the first South Asian American woman elected to the US House of Representatives, and one of only 14 naturalized citizens currently serving in the United States Congress. She's a member of the House Judiciary Committee, where she serves as vice chair of the Immigration Subcommittee and is elected the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Prior to that, she was a Taconic Fellow at Community Change, and before that, she founded and led One America, which is one of the most powerful grassroots groups in Washington state and around the country. So it's an honor to welcome you, Representative Jayapal.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dorian, for that introduction, but most of all for your leadership. I'm so pleased to be working with you. To my dear friend, Deepak, you are amazing, and putting together this forum today is just one way in which you continue to display your leadership at CUNY. And then to everyone that's on the panel, including my fabulous colleague, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, and all the leaders, this is really an honor for me to be with you today. And it's an important day for so many of us in the immigrant rights community. It's the International Day of the Worker, and a day when we traditionally organize for workers and immigrant rights in the streets. And so it's a good day for us to be together talking about this subject. Many of you know that immigrant justice has been my life's work for decades. I've been in the streets with many of you, organizing, using civil disobedience to draw attention to the moral path for justice and the necessary righteousness of humane immigration reform. What we know beyond a doubt is that the immigrant story is one of struggle and resilience. We face unimaginable challenges just to be here in the United States. We push boulders up mountains, and we succeed because we have to. Today, our immigration policy challenges are even greater because of a public health crisis that has cost Americans more lives than we lost American lives during the entire Vietnam War. We also have an economic crisis on a scale that rivals the Great Depression. More than 30 million Americans have filed for unemployment, and millions more have been unemployed but unable to file. Relief packages that we've passed by Congress have excluded enormous categories of workers, including immigrants. And every minute without action is a life lost, a business shuttered, a family devastated. This is all happening in a political landscape which has been defined by unimaginable acts of xenophobia and cruelty. And I don't want to waste my precious time this evening with you talking about those because you know it all too well. Instead, I want to talk about what we have learned from this crisis and how we utilize that learning for when President Trump is no longer in office. Because the forces of white nationalism and xenophobia layered on top of an already staggeringly unequal society, none of those things started with Donald Trump, and they won't end when Donald Trump is gone. Our me first instead of we first society has been around for a while, but the pandemic is showing us more clearly than ever the costs of that kind of thinking. So let's use this moment to rethink the rhetoric and the politics of exclusion and imagine a more moral immigration system. The pandemic has opened our eyes to a message that we in the immigrant rights community have been sending for decades, that the work of immigrants is essential, that too often invisible work is now visible as undocumented farm workers who live in fear of deportation pick the food that goes on our tables and in our food banks. DACA recipients and immigrants of all citizenship statuses helping to fight the spread of COVID-19 in our hospitals or care for our children, our elders, and so much more. There's a very perverse irony in that we call these roles essential, but we exclude workers from eligibility for direct stimulus checks, that we don't have safe working conditions to govern their safety, and the vast majority are still not eligible for healthcare in our broken for-profit healthcare system, even as data shows us, whatever data we have, that Black and brown folks have 2 times the rate of coronavirus as white folks. Just this week, a Gallup poll showed that tens of millions of US adults would avoid seeking potentially life-saving medical treatment for COVID-19 symptoms, even if they had the symptoms, due to fears about their ability to afford the costs of that. Everyone, no matter what their politics are, is now seeing how our fates are all interconnected. And more people are seeing the truth of our moral argument that you can't both be essential and treated this way. Protecting immigrants, granting them basic measures of humanity, decency, and healthcare is the moral thing to do, no matter what the circumstances. But even if you didn't agree with us on the morality, there is a selfish argument in the midst of a pandemic that allows us to bring in more people. Folks do not want the person on the front lines that's bagging their groceries or caring for hospitalized patients to be able to spread the virus. So there is an opening here for us as advocates to change minds and shape policy. That's why I've called for essential workers to be able to get a path to citizenship, to honor the work and contributions of their frontline work, in addition to the equipment standards and hazard pay they deserve. There's another opportunity, and that is to rethink the crisis of immigrant incarceration and the failure of an inhumane enforcement-only system that puts kids in cages and immigrants in prisons simply as they await their determinations in what is supposed to be a civil process. COVID-19 has made all of the costs of that clearer than ever. ICE's own medical subject matter experts call the immigration detention system a tinderbox scenario with no access to soap and water or the ability to physically distance in crowded facilities. And that's why I recently introduced a bill called the First Act with Senator Cory Booker to immediately begin to release the most vulnerable from ICE custody, review all of the cases to release anyone who doesn't pose a significant threat to public safety, and to stop interior enforcement during this pandemic. But beyond legislation, this is an opportunity for us to help people reimagine enforcement and recognize the costly failures of a system that puts tens of thousands of people in immigration prisons every single night. If we can't keep these most vulnerable people safe, we have an obligation to let them free in the midst of a pandemic like this, with attention, of course, to public safety. With all of that, what could a first 100 days of the next administration look like? with or without both chambers in control of Democrats. First and foremost, our next president needs to reverse all the Trump-era immigration executive orders and purge all the departments of white nationalist operatives that have come to rule in the past 4 years. But then we need to fundamentally restructure the Department of Homeland Security. Such a sprawling, unaccountable agency is showing us the problems of that size. So we should do the work now to push for the next president to separate citizenship services from enforcement. The same office that is charged with refugee resettlement should not be the same office charged with enforcing immigration laws. And an entity that deals with the delicate patchwork that is our citizenship and visa system should be governed by a cabinet secretary. We must broaden the scope of citizenship services to oversee a new suite of integration programs, from citizenship to English language learning to job training and development. Let's show the importance of this function to our country and our moral psyche. The next president should immediately implement enforcement mechanisms that don't depend on detention, surveillance, and removal. We don't need to incarcerate tens of thousands of people in order to enforce our immigration laws, and there should be no profit-making motive in incarceration, period. We also have to recognize that border enforcement remains inhumane and ineffective. Real solutions require us to address the foreign policy and economic development needs of sending countries, and to build global coalitions that focus on helping to protect the work, opportunity, and dignity of tens of millions of people who are simply seeking a better life. And finally, the next president should use real political power and any leverage he or she has to push Congress to pass a number of already bipartisan bills, from a comprehensive DREAM Act to a family immigration bill, to a complete immigration reform bill. It will take political leverage to eliminate the not-so-secret weapon of immigration as a political football that Trump and so many Republicans have callously used for so long. We have to give the next president the courage to use that leverage. We may need new tactics, new courage, and new resolve to change the full narrative, the way the Dreamers did, at the scale perhaps of a general strike. We may need to remember that it isn't just blocking streets, but bringing the economy to a standstill to push our point, with months of training and real dedication that mirrors that of the 1960s civil rights community or suffragettes. But we can prepare now, we can build now. We can breathe in the heartbreak of the coronavirus pandemic to build our unshakable faith that it is these hands and these bodies that shape the future. That unyielding sense of faith in a different future that drives immigrants to walk across deserts for days or cross continents for years or give up everything for safety. That unshakable faith that makes parents send a 16-year-old daughter across an ocean to forever be separated, that one day makes an immigrant congresswoman like me possible. The unbreakable resilience of the immigrant men and women and children who wake up every day to put one foot in front of the other, because we know that immigrants, we get the job done. I know we can do this, and I know we will do this. Thank you so much for having me with you today.
Thank you so very much, Congresswoman Jayapal. I want to ask you one follow-up question. And I just want to start where you ended, actually, because you said immigrants get the job done, and you are our champion in Congress. You are our champion in Congress. And so if you could talk to us a little bit about CARES 2, and for viewers that don't know, the CARES Act, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, I think is what that stands for. That passed Congress a couple of weeks ago. There is a CARES 2 package that potentially will come out of Congress. Can you talk to us about what you're fighting for in that package? You mentioned some of the exclusions in the first one. Yeah. Can you talk to us about what you're fighting for in the second CARES Act and some other things that you're championing in Congress, and tell us how to support you and the fight?
Yes, thank you. Well, the Congressional Progressive Caucus put together 4 critical priorities, and underlying all of those priorities are 3 principles. And the principles are that what we do has to include everyone, regardless of citizenship, disability, any other factor. It's just got to include everyone. Second, we want to make sure that whatever we do is actually taking a racial equity and wealth equity lens. And so at the end of the day, it's got to bring us out further stronger. And then finally, that everything we do needs to be directed at a people's recovery. It's got to be directed at the people. So our 4 top priorities are, first of all, we got to guarantee paychecks and make sure that economic relief goes directly to people. So I've introduced a Paycheck Guarantee Act, and this is what every other major country in the world has done. And the thing is that it targets the lowest wage workers, and guess who those workers are? Many of them are immigrants, they're folks of color. That's who's being laid off. And rather than pushing them into unemployment, we want to keep them employed and tied to their workplace. So this would be a really significant advancement to be able to have the Treasury direct grants, not loans, not delivered by community banks that have never really done much for our communities of color, but direct from the federal government to the business. And it would be by revenue loss, and it would continue until our economy is back. So that's one big first principle that's a priority. Second priority is essential workers. You know, we believe that we got to protect public health, and that needs to be not only investment in testing, contact tracing, all of that, but also that we have to make sure that we are literally taking care of the people who have given us their bodies on the front lines so that we can stay home. And so the Essential Workers Bill of Rights is a critical piece of our puzzle here, as is investing in our public health systems. Third, we want to make sure that we are targeting stimulus checks, mortgage relief, home assistance, water, utilities, all of those things that people need. We need to make sure that we're targeting them to the people that need it the most. If we pass a paycheck guarantee, then we will take care of some of that through the paychecks that people get. But there are still a lot of people that need help. And fourth, we need to make sure that we are allowing for health care for everyone. It is a crazy idea that in the midst of a pandemic, we will throw 35 million Americans off of health care. You know, I've been fighting for Medicare for all. I believe that's the right thing to do, but I just unveiled a proposal today that isn't Medicare for all, but it expands Medicare to cover those who are unemployed, have recently lost a job. It expands Medicaid to cover those who are close to the poverty line and were uninsured before the crisis. And then it has cost containment measures so that nobody is paying for anything related to this healthcare crisis. So those are some of our priorities. We're going to push hard along with protecting our elections and making sure that we have a vote by mail system, that we protect our post offices, our postal service workers. There's a lot of other pieces in here, but I think this is what we need to get in the next CARES package. What can people do? Ask your member of Congress to support these critical priorities. Ask people to sign on to the Paycheck Guarantee Act and the Medicare Crisis Proposal and the Essential Workers Bill of Rights. These are the pieces of legislation that should be included. And of course, nobody should be excluded. The virus doesn't discriminate by citizenship status, and neither should we.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to clap for you. I think everybody watching wants to clap for you, Congresswoman. This is why you're a champion. Many, many thanks to Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We're so delighted that you were able to join us this evening.
Thank you.
So, we are going to move to the rest of our panelists, our superstar panel. So I want to introduce them each now, and then they will speak in turn. First, we're going to hear from Steve Choi, who is the executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition, a coalition of over 200 member groups that represents New York State's immigrant communities. He has made NYIC into a powerhouse on policy and community empowerment in New York City and nationally, with a huge set of wins in the last legislative session in Albany. Great to see you, Steve. Thanks for joining us. Following Steve, we will hear from Stuart Applebaum. Stuart is the president of the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, otherwise known as the RWDSU. For 80 years, the RWD issue has fought for the rights of working people. The roots of the RWD issue were laid down in the 1930s when a group of local unions, including retail clerks and warehouse workers in New York City, banded together. Today, it's a leading champion of workers in New York City and plays a crucial role in empowering immigrant workers. Following President Applebaum, we'll hear from Saket Soni. Saket is a labor organizer and human rights strategist. He is the founder and director of Resilience Force, a national initiative to transform America's response to natural disasters by strengthening and securing America's resilience workforce. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and 2006, Saket co-founded the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice. Under his leadership there, the organization won organizing and policy victories for both US-born and immigrant workers engaged in the reconstruction of New Orleans, or Nolans. Following Saket, we will hear from Rocio Saenz, who is an SEIU International Executive Vice President. In addition to leading SEIU's fight for immigrant justice, Rocio oversees the union's support for the Fight for 15 and a Union, a movement of fast food, home care, and other service workers that has spread from one single strike in New York City in 2012 to more than 300 cities across the country and 50 countries around the world. In just 5 years, 22 million working people have won raises of more than $62 billion by joining together, going on strike, and speaking out to demand $15 an hour and a union. So with that, I want to toss it over to Steve Choi, who will lead us off.
Great, thank you, Dorian. And I just want to say how honored I am to be on this amazing panel with some great leaders of our movement. I want to take this time to share some thoughts about where we've been, what battles we fought over the last couple of years, and some of the lessons that we've learned. First of all, I think we've had to play a key role in being the tip of the spear that's aimed against Donald Trump, and some of the lessons that we've learned around that. I think back to the beginning of this administration, where we instantly realized that the world would never be the same. I remember that in the first 9 days of this administration, we held 10 actions, rallies, marches, and press conferences, and we didn't take any days off. We didn't take any weekend days off. And it culminated in that Friday, January 27, 2017, when Donald Trump signed the first Muslim ban into law. And that night, we heard that people were being detained at JFK Airport. And the very next day, we heard that dozens of people had been detained at JFK. And so on that day, that Saturday, on a cold, wintry January day, we started to send folks out to JFK. We sent out an action alert, and people started to come. And by the time that I got there at 7 p.m., there were 5,000 people there chanting, singing, saying that immigrants were welcome here, that refugees were welcome here, and that this is our New York, and we were not giving it back. Think about how amazing that is. Donald Trump did the impossible. He got thousands of people to voluntarily go to JFK. Nobody goes to JFK of their own accord, but thousands of people actually did it that day. And I remember getting on top of a storage container in a parking lot filled with those people and using the people's mic and saying that the fight was not over. We needed them to come out in 12 hours the very next day to Battery Park to protest. I got down off that storage container and we put up a Facebook post, and the next morning when I woke up, 10,000 people had RSVP'd. And we went to Battery Park that Sunday afternoon. 25,000 people joined us in the streets. After those 48 hours, I knew that our lives would never be the same again, and that for the next 4 years, we would be under unending assault from the Trump administration, and that we would have to fight with every single fiber of our being against that. And that has unfortunately proven true as you think about all of the devastating attacks that this administration has wielded against our communities. And I don't need to remind anybody who's on this right now about what those have been. But I would say that the biggest lesson we learned is that we needed to build power from the grassroots level up. And the insight that I've had is that we could use that not only to fight back against Donald Trump, but we also needed to use it to fight forward locally in New York City, in Long Island, in Westchester, in Buffalo, and in New York State. And guess what? we have been able to win some major victories, including a historic victory on driver's licenses. Almost exactly 20 years ago, Governor George Pataki stripped undocumented New Yorkers of driver's licenses, and we've been fighting ever since to get it back. And 14 years ago, Governor Spitzer tried to take this issue on, but he lost. And soon he lost other things, including his governorship for other reasons, but I'm not going to get into that. But from then on, that experience, this issue became the third rail of New York State politics. But where Eliot Spitzer failed, we were determined to succeed because we knew that we didn't have a choice with what we faced on the federal level. So starting in 2016, we started to build a powerful statewide coalition to win back driver's licenses. And last year, in the third year of the campaign, we launched a $1 million initiative to win it, and we did it. And you know why? Two reasons that I really want to point out. One, because we built real people power across the state, but also because we decided to be fearless in using it against anyone, including Governor Cuomo, and even against the Democratic leadership of the legislature. So while we were fighting against Trump nationally, we were also using our power locally, fearlessly. And we were building our power, and we were building towards the November election. And then now our world has been turned upside down with this pandemic. For years, we knew who the enemy was. It was Donald Trump. But now there's another enemy, this insidious virus that has devastated our communities here in New York. You know, I think about the number of jobs lost by immigrants here, and that has been terrible. But the number of lives lost by immigrants in New York is just tragic. And the fact is that immigrants here in New York have been on the front lines of this pandemic, but they are bearing the brunt of so much of the damage being wreaked by this virus. And so we've had to turn to this crisis with all of our attention, and we're going to need to be doing that. We've been focused recently on trying to get millions of dollars into the hands of our excluded immigrants who aren't eligible for a single dime of the trillions of relief dollars, but who need this help more than anyone. And now we're turning our attention, as a lot of folks have, to try to fight to make sure that these immigrants who are indeed on the front lines, who are putting their lives on the line, you know, preparing and delivering meals, who are cleaning infected facilities, who are driving patients to the hospital, we need to make sure that these immigrants get some kind of justice and relief from our federal government. And we need to throw down around this. And, you know, we need to use the power that we've built. We've got to use everything that we've got. And we have to be fearless around using that power to be explicit and to say, we are going to fight for cash relief. We're going to fight for the inclusion of undocumented immigrants in this next stimulus package. And we're going to have to target anybody and everybody to really make sure that's going to happen. I'm going to be frank, it's going to be an uphill fight. As you've heard from Congresswoman Jayapal, as you're going to hear from other folks, it is going to be an uphill fight. And to be frank, it's a scary and worrisome time for all of us. You know, and over the last couple of years, I've been reminded many times that the forces that are against us are powerful. You know, this president is powerful. He has the power of the courts, of the Senate, of hundreds of thousands of ICE agents and Border Patrol officers and immigration judges behind him. He has the power of the entire federal government behind him. And there are times where I've felt powerless and hopeless in the face of all that we endure with this president and now this pandemic. But in the midst of my despair, I've realized that we have some power too. We have the power of the people. We have the power of immigrants. We have the power of allies. And we have the power of so many of these leaders, including the folks who are on this panel tonight. And if we build this power and we use this power and we are fearless in using it, then I think at the end of the day, we will be victorious in our fight, whether we're talking about the inclusion of immigrants in the next stimulus package, whether we're talking about immigration reform of the kind that we need, whether we're talking about the justice that our communities so desperately need right now. That is what I'm really taking away from the last couple of years, that if we build this power and we are fearless in using it, then I think we will win that justice that we need. Thank you, and I'm really glad to be on this panel, and I look forward to answering all the questions we're going to get.
Thank you, Steve. Next, we're going to hear from President Applebaum of the RWDSU. Stuart, I think you're on mute, so we need you to unmute. There you go.
Thank you, Dorian. And good evening, everybody. I can't even begin to tell you how delighted I am to be part of this program on May Day. Earlier this week, we commemorated Workers' Memorial Day, when this year we tragically mourned the loss of so many working people who have died as a result of this virus, and all too often as a result of the inaction of their employers and of government. Today, May Day, gives us a roadmap for what we need to do to protect ourselves and to advance our interests. All over the world, May Day is celebrated by workers as their day. And here in the United States, May Day has come to have a particular emphasis on the struggles of our country's immigrants. What May Day means is that we need to take action. We need to organize. We need to speak up. We need to fight for our rights. As others have said, we want a future with jobs and incomes, just wages, collective bargaining rights, occupational safety and health, and universal social protection for every worker. And that, of course, includes immigrant workers. Even before the pandemic, 50% of all workers in New York City were immigrant workers. And now, during this crisis, that number has grown, as we have seen that most of our essential jobs are held by immigrants and people of color. Some of the worst, most dangerous and low-income jobs in this country. Just look at the meat, pork, and poultry processing plants that have been in the news this week, where so many people are getting sick and dying. People of color, immigrants, many without documentation, are the ones who are feeding this country and keeping us alive. There can be no labor movement without an immigrants' rights movement. They go hand in hand. That's why several years ago, the RWDSU decided to organize car wash workers in New York City, a workforce that consisted mostly of immigrant workers without documentation. These workers were one of many groups of immigrants being exploited in the city, working for wages that were below the legal wages, without benefits, and in bad conditions, and exposed to dangerous chemicals. Employers even stole their tips. Employers felt that they could do whatever they wanted, that they would get away with it because this workforce had no power because of their status, and nobody would care. Well, we cared, and we formed a coalition with two community groups, New York Communities for Change and Make the Road New York. We wanted to show that if these workers can organize, then anybody can organize. And we wanted to show another model of organizing where we create coalitions and alliances with community groups and others. We took a holistic approach to organizing, where we focus not just on problems workers face at the workplace, but with housing and healthcare and education, the broad range of problems immigrant workers face. We are able to organize and help transform this industry when we have a holistic approach. And we have continued to work jointly with our partners on many other struggles, including our work at Amazon. We believe that this is an important model for going forward. And let me also plug at this point what the car wash workers need. Most of them are out of work, and because of their status, they're unable to access the resources available to others. And if you'd like to help them and contribute to a fund for them, just go to the RWDSU website and click on the link, and you'll be able to help these workers. These car wash workers came mainly from Mexico and throughout Latin America, but the RWDSU represents workers from many countries around the world. It seems that employers are always able to find another group of workers to exploit more than the previous ones. The RWDSU represents 2,000 workers at a Tyson's poultry plant in Shelbyville, Tennessee, where about a third of the workers at one time were from Somalia. And given that we are now in the midst of Ramadan, I'm proud to say that about a dozen years ago, the RWDSU negotiated the first union contract in this country to recognize Eid al-Fitr, the end of Ramadan, as a paid holiday. Right-wing commentators started complaining. People started sending me hate mail. And I was told that my picture went up on a neo-Nazi website. They said we were being un-American, but I actually can't think of anything more American than respecting the immigrants who have built this country and are doing the essential work that keeps all of us alive. Earlier this week, we all heard about Trump's executive order forcing meat and poultry plants to remain open and to limit the employer's liability. It was outrageous. Plants had been closing to perform deep cleaning and to protect the safety and lives of workers. Workers are getting sick and dying. We only wish this administration cared as much about the lives of working people as it does about pork and chicken. The RWDSU represents thousands of poultry workers in the Southeast. They are mostly Black and brown workers doing difficult jobs in a low-paid industry. Too many employers have been compelling workers to work even when they are not feeling well, without adequate protective equipment or social distancing. And these practices have resulted in casualties. And it is these practices that are threatening the nation's food supply. If the administration had done the right thing at the beginning to ensure safety, we wouldn't be facing this crisis in the food chain. The administration has never hidden their anti-immigrant, anti-worker agenda. It's no surprise that there is no concern over these essential workers. They are brown and Black low-wage workers. There is no concern at all over who is falling to COVID-19. We have seen the statistics. Once again, Blacks and Latinos are being disproportionately impacted. The administration's strategies for COVID-19 are to open businesses again in hopes of an economic recovery before the elections, shut down immigration, and cripple sanctuary cities, some of the hardest hit by the coronavirus, by refusing them aid unless they rescind their inclusionary policies. Right now, times call for greater unity among all working people across all sectors and all backgrounds. We must continue to organize and join forces to elevate the issues impacting working people. Access to a safe work environment, access to paid sick leave and family leave, access to workers' compensation, hazard pay, and long-term federal living wages. But our fight won't be complete unless we also collectively amplify the need for housing justice, healthcare justice, criminal justice, environmental justice, and especially immigrant justice now during the current crisis and after. Last year, I traveled to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala at the height of the immigration caravans. to better understand the migration crisis through the lens of those living there. I met with our brothers and sisters, parents and children in some of the poorest, most dangerous neighborhoods. What I learned was this: the immigration crisis is a crisis of our own creation. And if we seek a solution, we must first account for displacing millions of immigrants through our own trade policies, drug policies, environmental policies. And second, we must develop a global solution that lifts up workers and their families both here and abroad. On this May Day, let us commit ourselves, when we get to the other side of this pandemic, to building a new world on the ashes of the old, a better world for immigrants and for all working people. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand it over to Saket.
Good evening. It is an honor to be with all of you, and an incredible honor to be with our champions, Representative Jayapal and Representative Ocasio Cortez. I want to start today by taking you to an epicenter of climate change, to New Orleans on Christmas Eve, 2005. 3 months after Hurricane Katrina makes landfall and the levees break, unleashing the floodwaters fatally into the city. That night, a man named Raphael arrives in New Orleans. The next morning, Christmas morning, he gets to work. He pulls decomposing bodies out of Ninth Ward homes without protective gear, climbs onto roofs to repair them without a safety net. His work helps people come home, but instead of being recognized and celebrated, he is mistreated by employers, hunted by immigration police, and demonized by politicians. I meet him one morning in a business district parking lot where his employer is supposed to arrive with his paycheck. I'm there to help Raphael and others negotiate a raise. The employer never arrives, but immigration police does. It's a payday raid, and Raphael escapes by the skin of his teeth. 14 years later, I see him again in Florida's Bay County. In 2019, Hurricane Michael rips through the Florida Panhandle and uproots pines and destroys 80% of the homes in some of the cities in the county. Raphael is rebuilding City Hall in Panama City. I learned that since Katrina, he's helped rebuild 7 great American cities. Houston after Hurricane Harvey, Baton Rouge after the floods, Durham after Hurricane Florence, and on and on. Raphael is part of a rising resilience workforce, the people whose talent and labor help us prepare for and repair after disasters. They include construction workers, but also nurses, paramedics, daycare workers. Disasters upend all of our systems for a long time, and these are the people who help us rebuild them. And a huge proportion of these workers are immigrants. Many are undocumented, like Raphael. Many whose foothold in America is tenuous at best are dreamers and TPS holders. Now, since Katrina, there have been $200 billion disasters. And in an era of climate change and increasingly frequent hurricanes and storms, resilience is a growing economy. This workforce, therefore, is growing. And to find a way through the new normal, we need them. Our survival depends on them. The problem is they're not secure. They're anything but. They're still mistreated, still hunted, still demonized. So like auto workers in the 30s who were in the middle of a rising new economy, resilience workers can become the bedrock of the next American society. What stands in the way is they're not recognized as the Americans they already are. So what would it take to change that? How might we make every American understand that their ability to survive in the future is tied to the security of immigrants on the front lines? At Resilience Force, we imagined that would be a decade-long project, and then COVID-19 hit. Overnight, most Americans are now concerned with their resilience, with their ability to survive, recover, come out stronger. They know that life itself depends on healthcare workers, grocery workers, delivery workers, farm workers. A vast proportion of these workers are immigrants. That's powerful. The question for us as a movement is, how are we going to tap into that power? Will we, or will we leave it on the table? And that's complicated. For most of you today, protecting and advancing immigrant rights is your top priority. But you know, there's a much bigger set of progressives out there for whom immigrant freedom is priority number 9 or 10 or maybe 14. So you're told we'll get to immigrants when the politics allow. There are bigger crises right now that are crowding immigrants out. I was undocumented after 9/11. That was a time when the national security crisis was crowding immigrants out. Then the recession, then the healthcare crisis, now inequality. Well, there is no bigger crisis than COVID-19. And what it is teaching us is that all of our survival depends on a resilience workforce that includes immigrants at its center. Immigrants are essential. They make us resilient. And we can unlock the power of that position. But to do so, our movement, the immigrant rights movement, must take responsibility for more than just the immigrant rights crisis. We must fight to solve, for one thing, the economic crisis as well. Resilience provides a powerful framework for that. That's why we're fighting in Congress for a publicly funded jobs program called the Resilience Corps that would put billions of dollars into public funded jobs. In the next CARES package, these could include public resilience workers who can be testers and contact tracers. In a future stimulus plan, they can include the repairers and rebuilders who will make our nation adaptive to the climate crisis. This workforce can and include immigrants as well as returning citizens, people in rural areas who face structural and long-term unemployment. Now, this solution may seem unlikely, its scale might feel improbable, but that's why we have to do our work not just in politics, but in culture to build public consent. That's why we're launching Immigrants Are Essential. With our partners at the National Immigration Law Center, we're saying we must translate the applause essential workers are getting into mass public consent and public demand that the immigrants in the essential workforce be recognized as the Americans they already are. For immigrants in the essential workforce, protective gear is important, but so is legal status. That is part of the protection that will allow them to work and allow them to solve this crisis. So where is Rafael now? He's responding the way he's always responded, at work, building resilience. He and immigrant workers like him are retrofitting buildings to turn them into makeshift hospitals, delivering groceries, and in the coming hurricane season, or the fire season, or the floods on the other side of COVID, they'll repair America again to help prepare us for our climate future. So this pandemic is tragic, it is terrible, it will be with us for a while. So it has plunged us into our future way of life. The pandemic is also a prologue for our climate reality. And to build power now, we must position immigrants not as the most vulnerable in these crises, but our best shot at surviving them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Saket. And before I introduce our last but not least, Rocio, I just want to remind you watching, if you have questions for any of our panelists, there is a little box underneath your screen from where you're watching where you can input your questions. So we encourage you to ask all the questions you want of our esteemed panel. Last but not least, Rocio Saenz from SEIU. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dorian. This is just so great to be here with all of you. I mean, especially I am so grateful with this leadership of the immigrant justice movement. And I want to really a deep appreciation to the work that Congresswoman Jaya Paul and Ocasio Cortez have done and been champions and speaking up and being a stronger voice. Let me just start by saying that no matter where we come from or the color of our skin, we all want the same things: healthy families, living wage, and respect for the dignity of our work. It is what inspired a group of immigrant janitors of different races to come together in Chicago 100 years ago to demand fair wages and a healthy place to live and work. And 30 years ago, another group of immigrants, this time immigrants janitors in Los Angeles, came together to demand the same thing: higher wages and safer working conditions. And I was so grateful to be part of that work in Los Angeles. And I'm so proud of the history in our union because it's the story of making the impossible possible. Especially when the rules are rigged against us, SEIU members have a history of winning against that odds because of their resilience. Our members are incredible fighters. And today is a May Day, just what the steward said. And we want to recognize the resilience of and fighting the spirit of all those immigrants before us who have been fighting. And just like me, the million SEIU members and also all the million more workers who have been united with the 5415 and the union, we stand on those shoulders and continue their fights. And we owe them, to all the people who have fought before us, an enormous grade of gratitude. And today our union SEIU includes Latino home care providers, Black airport workers, Asian healthcare workers, white government employees, and so many more. But we remain united: Black, brown, Asian, Native American, and white, by the same basic principles that we all stand behind. SEIU members are standing up for the rights for all workers, immigrants, women, people of color, because our history has shown that we all are having the same needs and our destinies are always connected. So together, our members are taking actions in their workplace and in the streets to demand an America that is welcoming to all people, no exceptions. Our members were traditionally excluded from labor law. Service and care work was performed largely by women, immigrants, and people of color, just like the way it is now. We work on farms, we took care of the sick and vulnerable, and we worked in homes. This work wasn't valued, and so we weren't eligible for minimum wage, overtime pay, or other protections. And the anti-worker and anti-immigrant forces divided working people against each other. For years, it worked. That playbook has been run against us time and time and again. We saw it work for 4 years ago with Donald Trump when he was elected. But I gotta say that people are fed up and they're not standing for it anymore. We're in a moment where the value of service and care work is being recognized like we have never seen before. And many of those essential workers on the front lines, many SEIU members are immigrants, and they're taking risks to perform critical roles where they've been left out of key protections. And we see people every night showing up to clap for healthcare providers and recognizing the danger people put themselves in just by going to work. But our public policies have not caught up. Immigrants have been left out of the federal response, just what we have heard. Mixed status families and people without healthcare are on the outside looking in. SEIU has called for all workers to put pressure at the federal and the state level to our leaders to help protect all workers who are protecting all of us. We need to keep the pressure in the workplace, in the streets, and in the polls. Anti-immigrant forces are not going to shrug their shoulders and give up. People who are fanning the flames of xenophobic responses for our Asian Pacific Islanders, brothers and sisters, are not going to stop overnight. But if there is one thing union members know, is when we stick together, we win together. We will continue to call on corporations and elected leaders to protect all workers. And when we say all workers, we mean all workers, including immigrants. These principles are key components of addressing not only today's public health crisis, but the historical, systematic, economic inequality, displacement, and exclusion that all immigrant workers face. It's time for all employers and politicians to take responsibility for the safety, health, and economic well-being of all workers. And regardless of the color, regardless of the immigration status, this crisis is helping us better to see who our real friends are and who have been our enemies all along. Our opponents aren't just the people who exploit immigrants or want to tear parents from their children and take away their livelihoods. They're also the enablers who are unwilling to stand up for working families and the soul of our nation. We see you and we know who you are. But I just want to say that we're not just victims. Just like Stephen said, we have the power, and we have the power of the people. We have the power to make real changes in our lives. We have to look at November and not miss our shout. It's like the musical Hamilton said. But when we win in November, because we're going to win, this is just the beginning. We need to make sure that we stand together and push forward a democracy and an economy that works for everyone, not just the wealthy few that uses race and class and immigration status to divide us. I just want to take a moment to just see how we have this power. Just look at this. The emerging power that we have, more than 23 million US immigrants will be eligible to vote in 2020 presidential election. It's roughly 10% of the national overall electorate. The number of immigrants eligible to vote has increased steadily over the past 20 years. And let me just take a look at the numbers, especially in the Latino community. So this is where we have not only that approximately every 30 seconds, a Latino in the US turned 18 and becomes eligible to vote. That's almost 75,000 potential new voters each month and almost 900,000 every year. Since 2016's elections, some 3.6 million Latinos will have turned 18 in time to vote this November. Many of them live in mixed status families. This is our kids. They've been watching what is happening to their parents, to their families, to members of our community, and they're learning and they're not gonna forget. And we need to make sure that they understand they have a duty to vote and to vote in support of their families and their communities and to better our country. So we are so proud to just be here in SEIU. This is part of the work that we are doing to making sure that we stand shoulder to shoulder with everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rocio, and thanks to all of our speakers. This was incredibly stimulating. So I want to take a second to just mention some things I've heard and then get into some conversation, because I know you guys are chomping at the bit to talk to each other. I want to remind our viewers that you can ask questions of our esteemed panelists. There is a box. It has a blue question mark underneath your screen. If you're watching this, just put your question in there and we'll try to get to it. So I heard a few things that I just wanted to put on the table here and then allow each of you to respond to each other based on what you heard. Steve reminded us that we do have power. in a moment where we might feel powerless, we do have power to affect the ways in which all of our fates are linked in this country. Stewart and Socket reminded us of the harsh and dangerous working conditions facing immigrant workers across this country. And so thank you for especially Socket for the story about Raphael, and for Stewart for talking to us about car wash workers, for instance. And then Rocio, I just want to take a moment of personal privilege, because my grandparents were migrant workers from the South, from the Deep South. And they made their way up to Chicago from Mississippi and Georgia. And they were early members of Local 1 of SEIU. They were janitors. And so I might have been born here, but my story is a similar story to folks that were not born here, right? We are all in some ways migrants searching for a better life. Some of us get pushed out, some of us get pulled here to different cities, but I'm just very proud that in my family history, we were proud members of Local 1. Rocio, you reminded us to target the enablers that are causing so much harm and pain in immigrant communities. So I want to make sure we stay on that for a little bit, because you also reminded us that November is it's a critical moment in showing our power, our electoral power, our narrative power. And so that's what I heard. I mean, this was such a rich conversation already, and we have some time here. So I just want to take a moment for each of you to respond to something you heard from another panelist, if you will.
I can start, Dorian. What I heard when Stephen talked about that we have the power in numbers, we have the power in people, we have the power in action, and just the examples again and again, just with a very clear sense that when we come together, when we arm and link arms as a movement, we can make changes. And I think we have been able to see it through, Stephen talked about the part of like immediately after the Muslim ban, the communities came together. And it was incredible response to continue to push back, and it's been pushing back all along. But it's not just that. We have the powers in numbers in the street, but also we have a powers in the numbers at the ballot box. And we should be able to exercise it.
Thanks, Rocio. Anyone else want to jump in? Stewart, and then Steve.
I think that we have a real opportunity. I think the comment was made about how people who were invisible are now being seen. And I think that for a long time, people didn't understand the dignity and value of work that was being done by people who are holding low-wage jobs, but are now seen as essential. I know within my own union, I see that in terms of supermarket workers. And I'm hoping that people are beginning to understand that in terms of people who work in food processing and the meat and poultry plants. And I think that we have to take that new understanding when we get to the other side of the pandemic and start to build something that is different than the world we're in now. We have to use the power that is being talked about and use this new understanding of the value and dignity of all work and of all workers to create a new way for the world to operate.
Stephen, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I'm really struck by what Socket said in the story that he told of Raphael, and how things were 15 years ago. And while so much has changed, so much remains the same. When you're talking about exploitation, when you're talking about, discrimination, when you're talking about the othering of so many immigrant workers, and during those 15 years, we've seen vast political changes from, even in the presidency, from George Bush to Barack Obama to Donald Trump. But in so many ways, the situation on the ground for a lot of these workers and immigrants is very much the same. And I just think it speaks to the fact that, we can't rely on elected officials, even Democratic elected officials, who are going to change things for us. We need to be building our own power and to be exercising it and using it against anybody and everybody. who is not going to recognize us and give us the kind of justice and dignity that we deserve.
Thanks, Stephen. Saket.
I think, a thread that runs throughout is, and you said this, Dorian, very eloquently, is, immigrant or not, we're part of a common story. People move looking for a better life. And there was a migration from the South to the North, away from racial terror towards a better life. There is going to be a mass migration away from climate disasters towards a more secure life. I think the question for us is, who are we taking responsibility for in our movements? And my proposition would be, we have to take responsibility now for more than just the immigrants in the immigrant rights movement. That on the other side of the COVID-19 curve, as Stuart put it, the sort of after we flatten the curve, there is a crisis greater and grander than the 2008 recession. One might argue even greater than 9/11. I mean, 30 million, as the Congresswoman said, or more unemployed. And this is the time where, what we have to do is, yes, win an election, of course, but there's a whole culture that is organized around gratitude for essential workers. And I guess my question back to everyone here would be, how can we, tap into the power we have in the culture? We have power in politics. We can exercise it. We also right now have power in the culture. When at 7:00, New Yorkers are applauding, but not thinking, oh, many of those are immigrants and they need a new legal status.
Thanks, Saket. And I want to come back to your question in a second. We have now lots of questions from the audience. Just to remind you, just put your question in the box underneath the screen, in terms of how you're viewing us, and we'll try to get to all your questions. So I want to start with question number one, and all of you have touched on these themes. This question is, how can we reach disconnected communities like undocumented workers who are suffering most in the time of COVID-19, who are largely suffering silently, and help them with their acute needs, while also galvanizing them to not be afraid to join in a public struggle for social justice, and especially in a time of physical distancing where we can't go door to door. So there's a lot in there, but talk to us about organizing strategies, particularly around undocumented workers. Who wants to go first?
I can speak very briefly about that. I would just say, first and foremost, I think it's critical to understand and meet people where they're at. And where they're at right now is they need cash in their pockets. They need health care. They need to be able to, bury their loved ones, try to figure out how they can stay afloat. I mean, the crisis that has hit New York City, and even outside of New York City, when you look at dairy farms, when you look at rural places outside of New York City as well. I mean, the economic devastation has been tremendous. They're huge. I mean, something like 4 out of 10 Latinx residents of New York City have either lost a job or have had a household member lose a job. And so money is not coming into households like that. And because of the fact that we're spending $2.5 trillion in federal stimulus relief and not a single dime is going to undocumented immigrants, they don't know where their next meal is going to come from or how they're going to make their next rent payment. So I feel like it's critical to meet people where they're at. And also the health problems have been terrible. I mean, I was talking to one of our member agencies, NICE, that works in Queens. The parents of one family, both parents are in the hospital with severe cases of COVID. And there's a 13-year-old daughter who's taking care of 2 younger kids. That's what the family household looks like right now. So I feel like, we've got to start and meet people where they're at. And where they're at right now is facing tremendous economic, health, life and death, devastation. I just think that's a reality. But in that, I do think that there's opportunities to reach people and figure out how to mobilize them and organize them, because I think, in crises, I think that there is a moment to reach people and get them to, and work with them to understand that we need far-reaching solutions right now. And now is not a time for compromise or half measures. Now is a time to really fight for it with everything that we have because of what is at stake right now.
Lucille.
So I think this has been a very important part of conversation and also activism, why the union matters. Like in a place, and especially for some of the industries that we're in, the janitorial industry, where is majority immigrant, where it's been just the big difference when you have a union and when workers are seeing that there is some protection that they themselves are having because they have a voice, a worker voice together is makes a big difference. And this is, we're seeing this with the fast workers, movement, that you see the strike in McDonald's, and this is workers coming together and demanding in one voice, like how they're going to be protected and how they're going to be changes. So I think this is a part of how we continue in the long run, making sure that workers have a voice, and a voice is through a union. That's an important. At the same time, is in this moment, it's been just great to see how our movements also coming together and demand, while the federal is being leaving behind a lot of immigrants, which we are going to be in the fight at the state and local level. Some of the governments are stepping up. And this is going to be key to just keep moving at the state and local level. Some protections for immigrant workers and undocumented is going to be crucial.
So that lets me pivot to the second question, and then I'll come back around to you, Stuart and Saket. But Rocio, you mentioned what states and local municipalities and governments can do. We have a question from a viewer, an audience member, that's really like the federalism question, which is, it gets a little tricky in terms of immigration policy, but you started there. The question is, what can states do to respond to the crisis immigrants are facing, especially if there's a Supreme Court ruling ending DACA, and there's just other inaction and blocks at the federal level? What can states and local governments do? So any of you can answer that. I know, Stuart, you wanted to jump in also on the last question, but we have this question about state and local governments too on the table. And Stuart, you have to unmute yourself so we can absolutely hear you.
I'm actually going to say that I'm going to defer to Steve on what government can do at this point, but I just wanted to add a point, if I could, to what Rocio was saying before we move on to this. And I, of course, agree completely with what Rocio is saying, and I almost always do, probably always do. But I would add one other thing that we're seeing right now, and that is how many people are actually reaching out to us. It's not just our reaching out to them. In this moment of this pandemic, people understand that they can't trust the boss, they can't trust government, and they're looking for some sort of collective voice and a collective response. And I think that is something that we really need to recognize and take advantage of, because people who are willing to tolerate so much are not willing to tolerate sacrificing their own safety and their own lives. And at this moment, there is a great rush of people coming to unions.
Thanks, Stuart. Anyone else want to jump in on this question? The state and local level.
I just want to jump,
you started to raise it, so why don't you jump back in?
Sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
I would just say really briefly, we need our state and local governments to put cash in the hands of our most vulnerable community members, period. I think about Governor Cuomo and all the plaudits he's getting, but, last week, Governor Newsom in California said that he was going to put $50 million or $75 billion specifically to cover and to provide cash benefits and relief to undocumented immigrant workers in California, pointing out that they put billions of dollars into the economy and they're pillars of the community. And Governor Cuomo turned around and said, well, we don't have the budget for that. It boggles the mind to think that we don't have the money. You know, we spent more on New York State spent more trying to purchase ventilators and didn't receive a single one on one of those contracts than an investment like that would cost. And yet, you know, you're not willing to actually meet that need and figure out how to support the folks who also put billions of dollars into New York State's economy and are key members of our society. That's ridiculous to me. So I think we need to push our state elected officials, and we need to push our local elected officials to really figure out how to invest and provide direct cash relief, especially to people like undocumented immigrants who've been excluded.
I just want to add one thing is in terms of the state and local, just because California has been an incredible example just to see what a government can do to expand the protection, just what Stephen mentioned, the state relief fund, but as well as to expand some of the protections that we saw with the, the grocery workers and more than that, the sick days or, family medical leave or the expansion of healthcare or Medicaid for workers. So these are like clear examples in this moment that has been so important for immigrant workers and for all workers, and especially this is about how we continue to make sure that this happens at the national level, but in the meantime, having the state and local governments to just work in this protection is very important.
Thanks, Rocio. I want to remind you, if you have a question, you can put it in the text box underneath your video screen. You can also start to put in questions for AOC, who will be joining us in about 15 minutes. So you can start teeing those questions up too. There's another question here, and this goes to you, Saket, first. And it's about culture and narrative. So the question is, are there any examples of how we can counter the narratives used to divide us? For example, what do you say to people when they say that immigrants steal jobs or immigrants drive down wages? So Saket, maybe you can start us off first, and then we'll get the others in.
Yeah, well, I think back at New Orleans after Katrina, and justifiably, there was so much fear about long-term economic pain on top of the suffering and loss and tragedy after Katrina. Immigrants came, like Raphael, to rebuild. And over the course of time, by really building immigrants into the life of the city, and certainly by waging fights, by fighting for a place in the city, we won the ability of immigrants to be fully recognized as participants in the Reconstruction. That didn't get them legal status, of course. That comes from above, from the federal government, but it did win them a place, and it did translate into local policy. It translated into power. And so it was a way of tapping into a bondedness, a relationship that non-immigrants had with immigrants around the rebuilding in the midst of crisis. We turned that into lasting relationship and lasting embeddedness. And I think what it gets to in this moment is, narratively and culturally, what we actually need is, immigration status doesn't need to be more important. It actually needs to be less important. The point we're making is that we all need to get through this crisis together. and that the people who put in the work to help us get through this crisis need to get back as much reward as everyone else, and that we should include the workers in our society who help us get through this crisis without distinction as to whether they've been recognized as Americans yet or not. That's the work of culture. And I think that New Orleans is certainly an example, as much as it's an example of the tragic crisis that started it all. It's an example of how, in the end, immigrants built for themselves a place in that society that I would say is now permanent.
That's helpful, Saket. Thank you. I'm going to ask my next to last question, and so any of you can get in on this, or you can answer any of the other questions we've asked. But this question comes from a viewer. There are lots of people talking about essential workers, and we've talked about this earlier. How do we keep that conversation going and carry it forward? And I want to add to this, how do we connect it to what's happening in November in this country? So as Saket has said, right, we all at 7 o'clock, especially New Yorkers, right, we're honoring our essential workers. But how do we keep that going, and how do we actually translate it into power, a certain kind of power come November in terms of the election? So anybody who wants to take that one.
It's a question of what we do now. It's a question of our telling the stories and highlighting the importance of what it is that people are doing. And we just keep talking about that afterwards when we get to the other side. And because I think there's a recognition now that wasn't there before. No one is saying, where is a public relations consultant? No one is saying, where is a stockbroker? What we're counting on are the people who are providing us the food and the care that enables us to survive. And I think that I think this is a key moment where we're able to change people's views. We don't go back to where we were before. We don't let that happen. We keep highlighting what it is that is being done by people who've often been in the shadows and overlooked.
I know Saket wants to get in. Oh, Rocio, you go, and then Saket.
Yeah, I just want to add from what Stuart said that this is first of all, this has been always essential workers, and this has been our fight, as Stuart knows, for a long time to make sure that there is the recognition of these workers for what they do and the contributions to this country. I think this is exactly one of the things that we gotta just keep on going, especially now more than ever, continue to tell the stories. And I'm very grateful for all the workers who are stepping up and they have done it, just to continue to tell the stories. And this is the job of how we all care about, and that we are going to hold accountable. Not only this is about what government, but also corporations. So this is how we are continue to make sure that they are seeing it, that this is not going to go away. We're going to continue to stay on as people are telling the story, as people are mobilizing, and people are coming together and joining together to make the changes.
So I'm going to do, I'll let you incorporate I know, Steve, you want to get in. We're going to do a speed round. So I need you to do this in a minute or less. I'm going to be timing you. Saket mentioned something that was quite compelling. He said this pandemic has plunged us into our future way of life. So the final speed round question for each of you is, what does that look like? Paint the picture for us. What does the future of immigrant justice and economic justice and racial justice and gender justice and social justice look like if the pandemic has indeed plunged us into the future? So I'll let each of you do that in 1 minute or less, and also other things you want to get in before we pivot to our final speaker.
Yeah, I'll speak real briefly about this, and I want to actually fold in my answer to the prior question. We have an organizing opportunity now. And that organizing opportunity is to make a statement that nobody gets left behind, that we all are in this. All of us are in this together. Nobody gets left behind. And I think there's an opportunity now, because so much of the stimulus package, the trillions of dollars that we've spent, have left a lot of people behind. When you're thinking about it, it's Black-owned businesses, essential workers, undocumented immigrants. There's so many state and local governments. There are a lot of folks who have been left behind. So how do we think about this as an opportunity to really put their interests front and center, create new coalitions across lines that we haven't thought about before, right? I mean, some of the most essential workers that people realize now are, teachers and medical assistants and nurses. They've all been there, but can we really create new lines, new coalitional lines, and then really push as hard as we can? The conventional wisdom of Washington is we can't get it done. Let's try to get it done. And then what we can do in terms of using that coalition to push forward, I think there's hope.
Thank you, Steve. Who wants to go next? 1 minute or less. Stuart, go for it.
I agree completely with Steve. I look at what's happening now. I think that there's a sense that people want to take joint action, work together, not be as isolated in their lives and what they do, even though we're social distanced. I look at the way there is more attention than ever before to unions. And I think that represents something else beyond unions. I think it represents a distrust of those in power, a distrust of government, a distrust of employers, of bosses. And I think that in the future we see there's going to be a desire of people wanting to join together and come together and to stand up to the forces that have made things bad for them.
Thanks, Stuart. Rocio, and then
so this is, I think we are in this moment where this is the heart and soul of our country. And there is no way that we got to go back to the way it was. It didn't work for working people. It didn't work for people of color. That has to change. We work together and we got to just continue to make sure that we will come stronger than ever if this is a moment that we got to bring out of the shadows all the millions and millions of people that are ready and able to speak up without about the rights, without the fear of retaliation or deportation. And I'm really proud to be part of this bigger movement that we can come together and much stronger than before.
Thanks, Rocio. Last but not least, Saket.
Well, I think we've been plunged into our future way of life in the sense that there have been, for the most part, a sense of, who has and who doesn't, who lived through 9/11 or Katrina and who didn't, who was inside the crisis of the recession and who wasn't. There have been insiders and outsiders in most American crises. This crisis has no outsiders, and the future crisis, the climate crisis, has no outsiders. And I hope that part of coming out of this, America is famous for forgetting, but I hope that we will remember that the way through the future for us is immigrant workers and other essential workers and the resilience they provide and the path they make. That's our passport into a future we can adapt to.
Thank you to Saket, Stuart, Stephen, and Rocio. Thank you for a very lively discussion. I hope you can hear the applause from folks watching all over the country and the world. So thank you. This was quite inspiring. And on this May Day, I am so honored to introduce our next and final speaker. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a third-generation Bronxite, educator and organizer serving the 14th District of New York and the Bronx and Queens. Ocasio-Cortez grew up experiencing the reality of New York's rising income inequality, inspiring her to organize her community. She has been a leading force behind the Green New Deal and a champion of immigrant rights and all working people. She's been on the front line of the fight against COVID-19 here in New York City, as her district is the most impacted in the nation. Communities of color, as we know, and immigrant communities have also been especially hit hard. So we're thrilled and honored to have the one and only AOC with us tonight. Congresswoman, welcome and thank you.
Oh, no, of course. Thank you. Thank you all so very much. And a big round of applause to all of our advocates, experts, and leaders that we're just kind of departing on in a conversation with. Thank you all so much. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that today is May Day, a day of international worker solidarity, in which we acknowledge the contributions of all workers in the United States and around the world. And just a few hours ago, we were convening with a lot of our immigrant workers here in the community, nail salon workers, laundry workers, domestic workers, and so on, telling their stories, street vendors and more, about how really our entire economy depends on them. Our entire way of life depends on immigrant workers and our immigrant community overall. There was also Representative Ro Khanna there in that conversation with me, who had joined me, and he reminded me that about half of our farm workers in this country are undocumented. And that means every time, it's such a stark reminder that every time a person in this country goes to a grocery store, picks up some fruit or some produce, half of that produce was potentially touched by undocumented hands, which means that our entire country eats out of the hands of undocumented people, eats from the hands of undocumented people. And the notion that that is the present condition, while we allow so many people to be cut out of our systems, the very systems that they contribute to, the very systems that they uplift, the very school systems and public systems and stimulus systems that they fund, and that our undocumented neighbors and brothers and sisters pay more taxes than Amazon or Facebook or Walmart often do. And yet when we draft these stimulus packages, we just allow it to rain gifts upon the people who take advantage to our systems, while we short shrift those who contribute so much and get nothing in return. And this moment, as was so eloquently stated before, this is our moment where we can change that, where we can challenge our systems of supremacy, challenge our frames with which we legislate, and not just with immigration, but really with a broad range of social issues, whether it's healthcare, living wages, hazard pay, and so on. And it allows us to acknowledge, it allows our policy right now is a moment that, and an opportunity where we can finally bring our policy in accordance to reality. The reality of the contributions that undocumented people and all immigrant families make to our community, the reality of our broken healthcare system, the reality of the fact that people are not being paid in accordance with the value that they present to society. And of course, the reality of our broken immigration system. Now is an opportunity for us to really take a look at our policy, and instead of having it within the frames of scarcity, within the frames of criminalization, within the frames of xenophobia, we can shift them to policies that come from a place of abundance, of mutual respect and coordination, and just a reflection of the reality that we all need each other. And that is an inextractable truth. And our policy can be shifted to one that is humane, that acknowledges human rights, labor rights, and beyond. And so with that, I'm just so thrilled to join you all in figuring out all of the specificity and details of what that looks like. And I'm happy to take any questions and also acknowledge the contributions of amazing immigrant fighters in Congress. As we just heard from earlier, Pramila Jayapal, we are in such tremendous hands with folks like her and Julian Castro advancing immigration policy with a very fine-tooth comb and extreme detail. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And as always, very inspiring. We have lots of questions for you, and they keep coming in. So let's start where you just left off, because we did hear from your friend and colleague, Congresswoman Jayapal, earlier about some of the priorities for CARES 2. And I want you to talk to us about what you're seeing and hearing and experiencing in your district with your constituents, the hardest hit in the country, based on your residents and what they need. What would you say should be the priorities for whatever comes out of Congress in the next several weeks? And I know things are moving fast.
Yes, no, of course. Well, I think one thing that we really need, and I was just out this morning delivering masks and PPE to not just healthcare workers. We stopped and dropped off masks at Jacobi Medical Center, but we were also working with the Yemeni American Merchants Association, dropping off safety kits and PPE with bodega owners as well. And we're dropping off meals. And I think one of the key things that's so important is it's not just about having a special side policy for immigrant families. It's about emphasizing universality in all that we do. And that is really what is going to help us actually tackle this problem. You know, if 6 months ago, someone just came from the future and told me you would actually be responsible for representing one of the most heavily impacted areas in the world in a global pandemic, I would have thought you were joking. But now, when someone's, now that we acknowledge the reality that New York 14 is one of the most heavily impacted areas in the world, while it is deeply impacting, it's not terribly shocking because our district is 50% immigrant. It's overwhelmingly working class. It is heavily Black and brown, and it is chock full of the communities that we find acceptable to leave behind in public policy. We say, yeah, we'll get to undocumented families later. Yes, we understand that there's racism and structural racism in our public policy. We'll get to that later. Yes, we understand that our healthcare inequities in the United States disproportionately impact communities just like ours. We understand, we'll get to that. And now what we're seeing now with how we are rolling out coronavirus aid, it's in that same frame. We'll get to it in the next package. Well, what our constituents need and what our communities need is for every family to be covered by a stimulus payment. It's for every family to experience rent and mortgage moratorium and relief. It is for every family to access unemployment benefits, every family who can access expanded SNAP and WIC without fear of immigration or deportation. And it is every family that deserves to feel safe from a knock on the door and from enforcement, whether it's from police, whether it's from eviction, or whether it's from ICE. Right now is not the time to criminalize communities. And I think beyond just making sure that we have specific provisions, moratoriums on deportation and beyond, we just need to emphasize the universality of the policies that we're already trying to emphasize. And so to that, I would say whatever Congress is legislating for itself as members, maybe extend that to everyone in this country. They decided to expand the funding of the attending physician in Congress. Great, because you acknowledge that our healthcare system needs more money for us, right? We need more money so that we can get tested. So just copy paste that to everyone in this country, and I'm sure we'll get it together. I'm sure we'll treat everyone quite justly.
I love that. I'm going to borrow that, the copy paste. Congress, copy and paste. What you do for yourself, you should do for everybody else in the country.
Exactly.
I love that. All right. So I have a couple questions here for you around immigration. So I'm going to combine them. One's really short, one's really long. So bear with me. The shorter question is there a pathway to citizenship in the near future that's possible? That's the short version. Here's the longer version. Joe Biden looks increasingly like the Democratic nominee, and his immigration plan includes ending Trump's travel ban and creating a path to citizenship for undocumented people. But he has failed to answer for his and Obama's record of deportations. And his platform stops short of promising real immigration reform. He has not come out in favor of decriminalizing unauthorized border crossings, for instance. How can the left push the eventual Democratic nominee to advocate for all immigrants, not just the ones with good jobs or who fit the model minority myth? So a lot there. I'm sure you have a lot to say in response.
No, and I thank you for asking that question, because when I raise some of these concerns, I am called entitled and this, that, and the other. And I think this is one of the reasons why I push, right? This is one of the reasons why I draw a distinction between voting for somebody and actually explicitly endorsing a candidate. Because to me, endorsement means I endorse your policies, I endorse your stances, I endorse your candidacy, your platform. And I think it's important for us to force this conversation. And we will be called difficult as usual, and we will be called inconvenient as usual, and we'll call grandstanders and all of this as usual. But we have to acknowledge the truth. And the truth is that the Democratic Party is not great on immigration, just overall. We have great folks in the Democratic Party on immigration. There are people, there are individual members that are great on immigration, but the party overall is insufficient and has a lot to answer for. And particularly in an election that we're going to have to rely on widespread increased voter turnout and enthusiasm. We have to answer these questions, and we have to tell immigrant families and everyone who loves immigrants in this country, here is the plan for you, and this is why you should find hope in a Democratic administration. And so what I would encourage folks is to not shy down based on that. This now is not the time to silence all discussion and say, well, do you want Trump to win every time someone asks a question? Now is the time to really push, especially before a convention, which we don't know if is going to happen in a physical sense. So I think it's extremely important for us to stand up and to reinforce that these are questions that deserve answers. And whether it's young people with issues like climate change and student loan debt, whether it's immigrant families on rent and mortgage moratoriums or deportation moratoriums, or a true path to citizenship, or decriminalizing our approach to immigration, we deserve to say, no, we deserve an answer. And just saying nothing is not good enough. And so I think it's important for us to push. I think it's important for us to draw those distinctions and to support one another when the inevitable, do you believe that fascism should win question happens. It so reduces and cheapens and silences conversations, because we all know that if the shoe is on the other foot and and Biden had a very problematic issue for affluent white suburban voters, that would be a hit the brakes moment. We need to talk about this and suss this out right now. Oh my God, what is your belief on SALT? That would be an issue up front and center. And so my recommendation is to treat immigrant families and to treat working people and to treat people of color just as important as affluent white suburban voters in this election.
So Congresswoman, you are my hero. That's the next question, but you're also my hero.
Oh, thank you.
So you're my hero. Can you talk about how immigrant workers are part of the Green New Deal?
Yes, this is an aspect, and the intersectionality of the Green New Deal is something that I am, as an aspect of this legislation that I'm very proud of, because what we do is that we center frontline communities that are most impacted by climate change, acknowledge the reality of what's about to happen. And the reality of what's about to happen is that, if you look at worst case scenarios, which most of us hope that the worst case scenario will not bear out, but actually so far, due to present action, we have done nothing to mitigate the worst case scenario yet. So we're talking about a spectrum of possibility. And the spectrum of possibility, the worst part of that spectrum is that in 80 years, half of the land mass in the world will be uninhabitable by human beings. Half. And we're talking about anywhere between our present percent up to 50%. So we could have 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% of of landmass on the planet uninhabitable by human beings in the next 80 years. This is in our lives, our children's lives, our grandchildren's lives. So what is the consequence of that? Massive migration patterns in the United States and across the world. And by the way, there is a level of justice and injustice baked into who is migrating and who is not migrating, because the vast majority of carbon emissions are coming from the most affluent and wealthiest countries and the most upwardly mobile economically upwardly mobile countries in the world. So it's the United States that will have contributed, and communities like the United States, Western Europe, et cetera, that would have contributed the most to carbon emissions. But it is South America and the global South that has contributed to this problem the least, but will suffer the most from displacement, monsoons, and hurricanes beyond. And so there is a justice element to it. I believe we should have an immigration policy. We are talking about in the Green New Deal, baking in and recognizing climate refugees as a visa status, because we are already seeing it. And we're not just talking about migration, internationally, but also migration within the United States, which has already happened. If you look at the massive migration that is nearly unprecedented in Puerto Rico, with the millions of people and their families migrating from the island to the United States, that's just a blip of what we're about to see in the coming decades. And that's why it's so important that we shift out of the frame of scarcity and criminalization of migration. What the Green New Deal also does is that it busts apart these frames of, okay, we can have social justice or we can have economic growth, which is kind of, I always find it so strange because it's kind of just bald-faced admitting of the shortcomings of capitalism. It's like we can either have human rights or we can have profit. It doesn't have to be that way. And so what the Green New Deal does is that it creates a mass investment to create tens of millions of jobs in the United States, which we will need immigrant families to help fill. And this is not unprecedented. We saw activity like this in the mid-19th century when we were experiencing unprecedented economic growth. The United States was actually creating and recruiting immigrants from abroad to help us build our country. And we can get back to that place, and we can do it in a way that also decarbonizes our economy.
Thank you so much for that. And a couple more questions before we wrap up. So this one's really about, it's an implementation question based on the first CARES Act. And as we're looking and as you're fighting with your colleagues around what's going to be in the next CARES Act. So let me try to summarize here what the question is getting at. There is, in terms of the disaster relief checks, right? The payments that went to cash payments that went to lots to millions of people. You either needed to have filed taxes from last year, or you needed a residency requirement in some way. And so the question is really getting at, if we really are serious about a fully inclusive CARES package 2, how do we implement it in terms of the undocumented population, in terms of ensuring that they receive help too, particularly where they might not be quote unquote trackable, right, with an I-10 number or something else. So can you just talk to us about how do we ensure from an implementation, there's the fight we need to have next, right, of ensuring the next CARES package and everything that comes out of Congress is fully inclusive of Black and brown folks and of immigrants in particular. But how do we think through those questions of implementation to make sure the help gets to the people that are most vulnerable?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a critical question. And we see, in questions like these, I try to look for parallels in other very vulnerable or hard to track communities, because we are experiencing similar challenges in getting stimulus checks to people experiencing homelessness, because it's very difficult. Oftentimes people open and close bank accounts. So even if they had a direct deposit set up, that wire may not be able to go to the same place. Obviously, people's addresses are changing. And so, there are ways in which we can try to identify some of these parallels. One thing that I can say is that I do think that if opening it up to iTunes will take care of millions of people, and it's an important step to acknowledge. When we talk about some more vulnerable folks who may not have an ITIN, I think there are certain ways that we can take a look at it. There should be some sort of verification of some kind of residency, so that if you're abroad, you don't just plug in your direct deposit information. I think there may be something with school records if someone has a child, or some other form of residency, whether you have state or local taxes. But we do have models set up for people who don't pay taxes. Sorry if you hear my dog in the background. But there are some models because we do have that portal. And so I think one way that is quite easy is that if you do have a bank account, you often have to prove residency to open that bank account. And so that also covers an additional chunk of people. Of course, it doesn't cover the unbanked, which then we'll have to figure out some other provisions for folks who are unbanked. But I think we can take care of, I think there's a lot of possibilities of taking care of a lot of folks who are banked. And the question is breaking that almost eternal public policy question of what we do with folks who are unbanked. But I absolutely think that there's a possibility, and right now is a great opportunity. We are pursuing the census, and we are answering a lot of these questions for hard to track folks in a census year. So I think we can also look towards those operations as well to figure out some inspiration in getting to the most vulnerable people.
Thank you for that. And final question, Congresswoman. Any advice on how those of us working for progressive change in this country and around the world, how can we stay resilient in the face of hatred and ignorance from the other side?
Well, that's always a tough one. I think a lot of it requires, as we know, a lot of this work just naturally requires a tough skin. When I first started running for office, total long shot, still working in a restaurant, for some reason, the great Ruth Messenger decided to take me seriously and sat down with me, and we had a cup of coffee. And this was very, very early in my run, like a year before the primary, perhaps. And one of the first things that she told me was that if you're going to get into this business, you're going to need rhino skin. That's how tough of a skin you need. And so I think part of that, cultivating that rhino skin, unfortunately, is a part of the work that we need to do, but also relying on some of those facts. So many people sometimes are shocked by just the plain realities that they don't know about immigration. One of the biggest ones when I continue to repeat that undocumented people pay more in taxes in our country than Amazon does. It stops people in their tracks. And the reason it stops people in their tracks is because it dismantles the narratives of immigrants as takers. It dismantles the narratives of immigrants as people who do not contribute to society, who are strains on our resources. And in fact, it flips the table because we're the takers, because we are taking their resources. We are sending our kids to public school. We are paying our nurses and creating our healthcare social systems based on their taxes, and we give them nothing back. So, I think finding ways to not just rebut narratives and to say, no, that's wrong, but to actively flip them and say, actually, they're not takers. You might be, I might be, and we need to fix this system. And when you look at all of those narratives as immigrants, the other classic one that we're already seeing as a compromise is, let's take green cards and make them for workers that we need, quote unquote, that we need, doctors and so on, this model minority myth. Well, don't we need to eat? Aren't farm workers essential? Don't we need, apples and fruits and all the food that we consume? Though that is just as essential as well. And also, debunking the myth of the unskilled worker, which COVID has largely done for us. Overnight, we went from unskilled and replaceable worker to essential worker. And people are exactly realizing how much they depend on the working class to eat. And when the working class falls, we will starve. And I think this moment has truly highlighted that and made that argument for us, but it's never, you can never remind people of that enough.
Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, thank you so much. I can never say ALC to your face, so I'll just do that behind your back. But Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. This was spectacular. And
thank you all for fighting and for convening on how to fight for a better world. It's truly needed.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to toss it back to Professor Deepak Bhargava of the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies and the co-organizer of this conference with his colleagues, Professors Lewis and Milkman. So, Professor Bhargava, back to you.
Thank you, Dorian, and this amazing panel of luminaries were CEO and Saket and Stuart and Steve and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Congresswoman Jayapal. I think we all wanted and needed that kind of insight and wisdom and inspiration tonight. I want to thank, on behalf of the School of Labor and Urban Studies at CUNY, all of you for joining us for this wonderful and amazing day of exploration about how we advance immigrant and worker and racial justice in our country. You will be able to watch sessions and talks on the SLU website, and I encourage you to connect with the school as a student, as a participant in our public programming, which will be ongoing through this crisis, and as a reader of New Labor Forum. Please stay tuned for further events hosted by the school, and also look out for our book about immigration reform and the path ahead based on this conference and these talks, and look out for a 2021 conference after the Trump administration is behind us and we are implementing an agenda for immigrant justice in our country. I can't wait. Thank you for spending part of your May Day with us, advancing immigrant rights and worker justice in America. Thank you. Good night.